Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. Your 14-year-old heart isn't cheered by the sound of wedding bells resonating through Bordeaux's cathedral when you wake up. On November 25th, AD 1615, as attendants fix the enormous jeweled crown that threatens to fall off your head, your childlike hands shake beneath layers of golden Spanish brocade. For the second time in your life, you catch a glimpse of your future husband through the incense smoke. The child who spent the morning of your wedding chasing rabbits instead of getting ready to meet his bride is Louis XIII of France, whose voice is hardly broken. Like water on glass, his gaze slides from yours to the stone floor, which he believes is more important than the female he will soon be in a lifelong relationship with. Ravenous animal. The Latin Mass, roaring from the altar, drowns out the whispered prayers in Castellan of your Spanish companions. As a pawn in the grand game between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, Anna Maria Marathio they will now call you, and eluding even your name has come from the sun-drenched gardens of Violi to this chilly French church. 11 years old, your father, Philip III of Spain, signed away your childhood. Spain has already estimated how much they would get back if your boy husband passes away too soon, and your dowry is worth 500,000 crowns. Everything has been considered, with the exception of whether two terrified kids could be content in each other's arms. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. When you were just 11 years old, in August of 1612 AD, the marriage contract was signed. You recall the day your father announced without asking that you would wed the French monarch. Peacocks in the gardens of the Royal Alcazar in Madrid. Your mother, Margaret of Austria, had given birth to your youngest sibling and died less than a year later from infant bed fever. Her duties, such as taking care of your siblings, leading household prayers, and being a little mother before you had fully grown up, were passed down to you. The things your father said were like pebbles in a pot of water. A language that sounded like water bubbling over rocks was spoken in a northern country, where your Aunt Isabella had gone to marry and never came back, where the sun hardly ever shone. You were aware of the long-standing animosity between France and Spain, that a peace as delicate as spun sugar was supposed to be sealed by your marriage. You had no idea that you would never again go barefoot through the orange fields of Valencia, where your family spent summers, or see another Spanish sunrise or tostegazpacho, prepared according to your mother's recipe. It took 3 years to negotiate. Your face was painted and repainted over the course of 3 years of portrait exchanges to make sure you appeared enough Habsburg, sufficiently virginal, and sufficiently deserving of a Bourbon monarch. At the Spanish court, depicting a boy with a weak chin and sad eyes, draped in enough lace to furnish a monastery. His mother, Merida Medici, ruled France while he played with toy soldiers, according to your ladies, who also whispered that he was ill and favored his gallant falconer's company over any other woman. What kind of boy he was, though did it matter? They signed the documents. You were doomed. The 18th of October, AD 1615, the Burgos proxy wedding. Your brother Philip represented Louis and Bordeaux, and you married an empty chair covered in French lilies. Two princesses were traded like exotic birds, never to return to their home countries. When they married Louise's sister Elizabeth, the Spanish gold was heavy as armor, and you wore your mother's bridal gown, which had been adjusted to match your smaller frame. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Burgos, whose Latin was as smooth as rain on stone. "I do," you said. You vowed your body and soul to a boy you had never met in front of an empty throne. Become the absentee's wife. It took 40 days to get from Spain to France. 40 days of shivering carriage rides in the fall rain, eating meals that became more bizarre as you went north, sleeping in weird beds that smelt of other people's lives. Your mother's friend, Donna Estefa de Vigilin, was one of your Spanish ladies. French was taught to you by Donna Catalina de Sa. Since childhood, little Maria de Monteayer has been your diminutive companion. They made an effort to turn it into an experience. To block out the rain, they sung songs in Spanish, taught you the roadside dances of the French court, held you while you woke up crying from home-related dreams. The formal exchange was held at the island of Fessence in the Badassa River. For a single suspended instant, you are on a platform built above the water, with France on one side and Spain on the other. Philip whispered in Spanish as he gave you a final embrace. Keep in mind that you are of Habsburg ancestry. Then you crossed the platform to your new existence, moving farther away from everything you had known with every step. With tears running down her cheeks, Elizabeth of France walked past you in the opposite direction. Two princesses were walking over the Black Sea, each of them going into exile. Spanish court attire placed a strong emphasis on dignity and restraint, and your first impression of the French court at Bordeaux was like a physical blow. French clothing appeared to be made to show off as much skin as possible, while yet being technically appropriate. You could see the beating of women's hearts as their breasts swelled above corsets cut so low, held the hair in place as it was tortured into gravity-defying patterns. All of them spoke at once, a blend of French, Italian, German, Dutch, and the cosmopolitan language of European aristocracy, which somehow omitted Spanish. Your new mother-in-law, Merida Medii, scrutinized you like a horse at a sale, even though she was ostensibly welcoming. You, her French, seemed menacing due to her strong Italian accent as she moved slowly around you. She told the court that she is darker and smaller than anticipated. Well, what can one expect from Spanish blood? With one ring-encrusted finger, she studied your face and raised your chin. She has nice teeth, at least. With luck, she will produce enough offspring. Then Louis walked into the hall, and your heart tried to balance fear and hope. He was born in September 6001 AD, exactly 5 days after you. At the age of 14, it just so happened that everyone called destiny. However, destiny appeared in front of you as a lad who avoided eye contact, with hands that trembled just as much as yours, and appeared to prefer being somewhere else in the world. His lips, as dry and frigid as paper, hardly touched your cheek when protocol required him to kiss you. This show of royal adoration was praised by the court. You pondered whether this, a presentation for an audience unconcerned with the performers, was what love looked like in France. 7 hours were spent at the wedding feast. 7 hours spent sitting next to a stranger, who was now your husband, while you watched him routinely disregard you in favor of talking to his hawkmaster about hunting. You made 2 attempts to talk to him, one of which weighs about music. He once played Fellet about his family, you were told. He turned away after responding in monosyllables each time. On a subsequent visit from England, the Duke of Buckingham would write that he had never seen a bridegroom more sad, as though he were being carried to his execution rather than his bed of marriage. The ladies of Thebichamber came for you when the court physicians said that the astrologically suitable hour had arrived and darkness had finally fallen. You were stripped nude in front of strangers. Witnesses were required by French protocol to make sure you were pure, a virgin who was able to conceive. They conducted a clinically detached examination of your body and reported their results to a secretary, who entered them into a ledger. There are no obvious flaws. He is whole, his hips are suitable for childbearing, and his breasts are growing in line with his age. You discovered that queens had no right to modesty while you were 14 years old and in front of 24 French courtiers. Louis, who appeared much more frightened than you were, waited in the royal bedchamber after they had dressed you in a nightgown, so sheer it might as well have been made of morning mist. The bed was blessed by the Archbishop of Bordeaux. Mara Medici delivered clear, loud directives regarding thayer production and royal duty. The mechanics' consummation were discussed in agonizing detail by the court physicians. Then, mercifully, they left you alone, though you knew they waited just outside the door, listening for signs that the marriage had been properly sealed. Historians disagree on what transpired after it. The following morning, the marriage was proclaimed, consummated in the official record. The court was shown the bloody sheets as evidence, but later on, staff would mutter that Louis had spent the night curled up on the far side of the huge bed, not touching his wife, and that the blood was from a chicken. Not even in your private letters would you mention it. However, Louis refused to sleep on your bed for 4 years. 4 years. 1,460 sleepless nights in French castles, wondering what flaw in yourself had caused a spouse who favored his hunting, hounds and male favorites above his wife's chamber to leave. The court kept a close eye on you, anticipating pregnancy symptoms that never materialized. New humiliations came with each month that went by without a pregnancy. After examining you several times, the doctors declared your womb frigid and prescribed disgusting concoctions made from bull's blood and powdered pearls. The courtiers muttered that you were cursed, infertile, and possibly not a real lady at all. Louis, meanwhile, led an odd life of his own. Although he was not in power, he was king in name. The Concinis, Mara Medici's favorite Italian family, dominated France. Louis played soldier with the household guard, trained falcons, and went hunting throughout the day. The court made an effort to overlook his odd tendencies. He kept meticulous notes of every person who passed away in Paris because of his preoccupation with death. He always had a tendency to swoon at the sight of women's exposed shoulders, and when he was worried, he would stutter. According to your ladies-in-waiting, if he happened to run across you in a hallway, he would practically flee. Everything altered in 1617 AD, influenced by Charles d'Albert, Duke of Luynes. His favorite, Louis planned a coup against his mother. On the Pontiff Concino Concini was killed. Louis watched from a palace window as a mob mutilated his body. Exiled to BL was Merida Medici. When the Queen Mother was present to enforce basic civility, you were hardly tolerated in the court, and now, at 16, you were genuinely alone. Louis removed all Spanish staff from your family as soon as he took control. On a Tuesday morning in April, it took place. When you woke up, French guards with lists were waiting at your door. Donna Stefania was given an hour to pack after holding you through nightmares. Donna Catalina was led to a carriage headed for the border, where she taught you to speak French without a strong Spanish accent. Even Maria, who has been your dwarf friend since you were 7 years old, was dismissed after being accused of being a Spanish spy. You pleaded with Louis to allow you to keep one person you knew well, someone who could converse with you in the language of your early years, and who knew your mother's lullabies, saying that Spain was France's enemy and that you needed to learn French. He turned down that odd boy king who was your husband. You made an effort. You tried, God knows you did. Even though the low-cut gowns made you feel naked, you learned how to dress like a French queen, though it appeared to be intended to make ordinary chores impossible. You learnt the intricate etiquette of Versailles. To serve the monarch a drink of water, 43 steps must be taken. You learnt to dance the French court dances, though they lacked the fervor of even though you continued to dream in Spanish and wake up speaking Castilian words that nobody could understand, you even learnt to think in French. A short Thor entered your frozen marriage in 1619 AD. Louis started coming to your rooms, possibly because Louis wanted to guarantee the succession. The interactions were short, awkward, and mechanical. He would show up after dark, carry out his marital responsibilities with the zeal of a man on medication, and then depart right away. Within months, you became pregnant. The court was elated. In every French church, hymns were sung. In your womb, you carried the Bourbon dynasty's future. December of 1619 AD, your first child, a wonderfully formed boy who never breathed, was born dead. The midwives covered him in silk before you could hold him, but you saw his face, Louise Wiss's weak chin, and your dark hair. The court accused you right away. You must have poisoned the unborn child in your womb by eating something improperly, moving too quickly, or harboring devious ideas. With a look of disgust on his face, Louis stood at the foot of your bed while you were bleeding and uttered the words, "Try harder next time." You became pregnant once more. 3 months later, the court doctors placed you under virtual house arrest this time. No dancing, no walking, and no reading of anything that could make you laugh. You felt the child move inside of you like a fish, in a dish as you lay in bed for months, watching the changing of the seasons through windows you were not permitted to open. You were so eager for air in March of 1622 AD that you persuaded 2 of your ladies, who were now all French, to accompany you on your walk through the grounds. You stumbled on your thick skirts while laughing at some ridiculous court rumor and jogging a little because it felt nice to move. Even if it was only a slight stumble, you were bleeding by the evening. They lost the second child. It was awful to see Louis so furious. While you were still bleeding, he barged into your chambers and yelled that you had killed his heir, and that you were either purposefully undermining the succession or acting carelessly. He called you a Spanish witch, a Habsburg curse on the House of Bourbon, and the whole court heard him say it. He hit the wall next to your head so forcefully that his knuckles bled as you attempted to apologize and explain. He spat at age 21. Additionally, you are unable to carry out the single purpose for which you were bought. Bought, not married, bought. The ensuing years blended together in a fog of growing desolation and loneliness. 123, 1624, and 1625, hopeful, sad, bleeding, pregnant, and held accountable. A total of 4 little coffins and 4 stillbirths. Louis glared at you so disdainfully 4 times that you feared he would just have you put to death for not making an hair. The court doctors made every effort, bloodletting prayers to particular saints, special diets, and setting your bed to attract particular planetary influences. Nothing was successful. Then followed the ascent to power of Cardinal Richelieu in 1624 AD. If you previously felt that your life was challenging, Richelieu turned it into a beautiful nightmare. Richelieu was calculating where Louis was cold. Richelieu watched you all the time. While Louis ignored you, there were rumors that you had turned down his advances early in his tenure. Regardless of his reasons, he made ruining you his second job after leading France. Even if his animosity undoubtedly felt personal, Louis was persuaded by Richelieu that you were a Spanish spy, that your letters to your family were treasonous, and that your visits to convents were a front for a plot. He set up servants who searched through your possessions, ladies in waiting, who reported everything you said, spies all over your home, and even a confessor who broke the sanctity of confession to report your prayers. You learned to have no faith in anyone, to talk solely about the weather and fashion, and to keep your innermost feelings hidden so well that you are occasionally unable to discover them for yourself. Malene de Fargas was sent into your home as Dame Dao by the Cardinal in 1626 AD, just to spy on you. However, Malene's intelligence and beauty allowed her to see through Richelieu's plans. She taught you the subtle art of court intrigue and how to look obedient while retaining your dignity. And she ended up becoming your buddy, possibly your only true friend in France. Malene taught you that in France, power came from patience, rather than conflict, from outlasting your adversaries, rather than defeating them. The day of dupes began in 1630 AD. You and Marie de Medici, who has since returned from exile, attempted to persuade Louis to fire Richelieu. You believed you had succeeded for a single, magnificent moment. Louis appeared to concur and was prepared to break away from the cardinal's control. But Richelieu was too astute and indispensable. He made things well by evening. Once more, Marie was banished, this time for good. You were more alone than ever, more attentively watched, and much less trusted when your supporters were removed from the court. When France started war on Spain, in 1635 AD, it was the worst. Officially, the adversary was now your brother, Philip IV. It was treason to write to your relatives. It was sedition to show concern for Spanish casualties. You wrote to Philip about your loneliness, your dread, and your frantic want to meet a familiar face. But Richelieu intercepted the letter. Lou was shown it by the cardinal as proof of the plot, even though all you had done was express your longing for your brother. Your lowest moment was in 1637 AD. Spies learnt that you were smuggling letters to Spain through your visits to the Valderas convent. There was no denying the evidence. You had been communicating with your brother, providing him with details about French court life, but nothing that could be considered true espionage or of military use. You were dragged like a regular criminal before the King's Council. Richard used theatrical flair to make his case, portraying you as a Habsburg agent who had spent 22 years sabotaging the kingdom from within and a snake in France's bosom. They inquired as to whether you had planned to wed Lou's brother Gaston d'Orléans following the king's passing. Because the claim was so ludicrous, you laughed, and the sound of your laughter reverberated across the room. You looked straight at Louis as you replied, "If I wanted to escape my misery by marriage, why would I pick another prince from France? You say I'm the Spanish spy, but wouldn't I run to Madrid as soon as I became a widow?" Nothing was seen. On Louis's face, he sat there like a stranger judging a stranger. This man had been your husband for 22 years, blamed you for every stillbirth, and deprived you of all comfort, friends, and ties to your home. Ultimately, the only reason you weren't put to death or banished was because doing so would have strained relations with Spain. Instead, you received a sentence that included ongoing isolation, surveillance, and marriage to a guy who hated you. Then came the miracle, or, depending on how you interpret the ironies of fate, the curse. On December 5, 1637 AD, Paris was hit by an unusually violent winter storm. Although Louis had intended to go tossed mule, the roads were impassable. The Queen's rooms were the only suitable sleeping chamber, and protocol required that he sleep at the Louvre. Your husband would sleep in your bed for the first time in years. You were 36 years old. You had been wed for 22 years. For stillbirths, innumerable humiliations, and total separation from all you had loved were all things you had to endure. The man who had made your life a cautious hell was now forced to share your bed because he was trapped by a storm. What happened that evening between you? Where did the rage eventually turn into something resembling tenderness? Where, in the gaze of another, did the loneliness recognize itself? Where 2 decades of collected hurt that only you and Louis ever knew were overcome by the basic biological drive. However, on September 5, 1638 AD, 9 months later, you gave birth to a live boy. France was ecstatic. For a whole week, church bells rang from every hilltop, bonfires were burning. Luigi Rudona was the child's given name. Louis, the God-given, as though the Bourbon dynasty had been saved by divine intervention. When you were 37 years old and everyone had lost hope after 23 years of a fruitless marriage, you had created the heir that France much needed, even though his eyes were as icy as winter stone. Richard himself knelt in front of you. You were declared blessed among ladies by the court that had been spreading rumors about you for decades. Louis hardly gave you a glance when he visited his kid, the woman who had at last granted him what France as a whole had requested. Maybe those years of emptiness were too much for him to forgive, even though the boy would grow up to resemble his Bourbon ancestors in every way, including having the semi-hevelited eyes and big nose. It's possible that he suspected, as some whispered, that the child wasn't his. Or maybe Louis was just unable to overcome 23 years of meticulously built disdain. 2 lightning strikes occurred 15 months later. After decades of loss, you gave birth to 2 healthy sons, Philippe d'Orléans, on September 21, 1640 AD. The Court doctors, who said your womb was uninhabitable, now said it was miraculous. Even though you were 39 years old, by royal childbearing standards, you had quickly given birth to 2 flawless sons. It was referred to as divine intervention by some. Darker hypotheses were murmured by others regarding the storm that had compelled Louis to your bed, and whether the king had indeed been the lone guest that December evening. But what they muttered didn't matter to you. Your sons were born. You had individuals who were genuinely yours, and they couldn't be taken away by royal edict for the first time since you left Spain. With the ferocity of a person who has waited to long for water in a desert, you hurled yourself into parenthood. The court, which anticipated royal babies to be given to wet nurses, was shocked when you nursed them yourself. When no one else was around, you taught them Spanish lullabies, determined that they would never experience the abandonment you had experienced. You kept them safe through fevers and nightmares. Meanwhile, Louis was dying. By 1642 AD, he was coughing up blood due to tuberculosis that had spread to his lungs. In December of that year, Richu passed away. You may have felt victorious, but Louis was too sick to be interested in politics. His last months were devoted to writing a will that will deprive you of authority, even after you've passed away. According to the will, your 4-year-old son would formally rule France through a regency council. You would only have the title of Queen Mother in name, with no actual authority to make choices without the council's consent. His last act was to guarantee your continued helplessness after you had been married for 28 years, had given him the heirs he desired, and had endured everything he and France had put you through. Louis passed away on May 14, 1643 AD, wearing the same black Spanish silk you wore to your wedding. You stood by his deathbed, observing the boy who had become your tormentor lose his life. His final words were for his son, not for you. Better than I was, be a king. Then you were a free, and he was gone. However, since you were still tied by his will, you weren't. However, during those years of isolation and monitoring, Anne of Austria, longer Anna Maria Mauritia, had learnt to play French politics. That girl was too deeply buried to be revived. You appeared before the Paris Parliament a few days after Louis's passing. You persuaded them to violate the deceased king's will, spoke French without a hint of a Spanish accent, and donned mourning garments that revealed the steel in your spine. You informed them that France required strong leadership rather than committee-based governance. You reminded them that you had given France 2 princes and that you had been faithful for 28 years without complaining. Even worse, you capitalized on their xenophobia by saying that, as a foreigner and a woman, you would require French advisors and would need to rely on French knowledge and flattery, which gave them the impression that they would still be powerful. You were elected sole regent of France by the same individuals who had watched Richelieu degrade you for decades. Cardinal Mazarin's appointment as chief minister was your first action. Ironically, Richelieu's protege is a man with a quite different personality. Mazarin represented Italian silk where Richelieu had represented French steel. Mazarin tried to help you, whereas Richard had tried to break you. Others claimed he was looking for more. Rumor had it that you and the cardinal were in love within a year. After a lifetime of marital anguish, some even asserted that you had secretly married and that the Spanish princess had finally fallen in love with an Italian cardinal. Mazarin guided you through the perilous waters of the Regency, whether he was your lover or just your closest advisor. You displayed bravery that no one had imagined you possessed when the Fronde civil wars broke out between 1648 and 1653 AD, when French aristocrats rebelled against royal authority and demanded the power that Richelieu had taken away from them. You snuck your young sons out of Paris in the dark of night when crowds attacked the palace. Philippe was wrapped in servant clothes, and Louis XIV was concealed in a wash basket. You followed Mazarin's advice to split your adversaries, pretending to exile him while secretly corresponding when rebels demanded his head. Rebels barged into the sleeping chamber of the young Louis XIV during one of the Fronde's most perilous moments to make sure he hadn't left Paris. Armed men, any one of whom could have killed the king, passed through as you stood next to your 10-year-old son's bed. Your voice didn't falter, and your hands didn't shake. "Gentlemen, the king is here, as you see," you stated calmly as you pulled back the bed curtains yourself to reveal the sleeping youngster. "I hope you'll let His Majesty slumber some more." Disgraced by your honor, the rebels withdrew. Louis XIV's declaration of age at 13 in 1651 AD marked the official end of your regency. However, everyone was aware that you still had actual authority. You now negotiated European accords, despite being prohibited from writing to your family. You, who spoke Spanish and were charged with treason, now had diplomatic relations with every court from Vienna to London. You led France through a civil war and came out stronger than before, while being held responsible for every stillbirth. You mediated the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 AD, which put an end to the protracted conflict between France and Spain. The pact stipulated that your brother, Philip IV's daughter, your niece, Maria Theresa of Spain, would be married to Louis XIV. You didn't miss the irony. A French monarch is getting married to another Spanish princess. For a foreign court, another girl is abandoning everything she knows. You attempted to prepare Maria Theresa by warning her, but how could you account for 28 years of meticulously controlled suffering? For the first time in 45 years, you encountered Philip at the wedding in 1660 AD. Philip IV of Spain, your brother, had grown into a man you hardly knew. Presuming you had forgotten, he whispered in Spanish as he gave you a hug. However, your response was fluid, like water pouring back into a dry riverbed. "I promised him I never forgot. I've just learnt when to forget." Philip brought up the recent conflict between your nations, maybe anticipating an explanation or apology. You shouted it loud enough for both courts to hear. "I was a decent French woman. I owed it to France, to my son, and to the king." The group from Spain appeared astounded. Their lost princess had completely adopted French culture. However, you cried for the first time in years that night while you were by yourself in your rooms, mourning the Spanish girl you had to murder in order to live as a French queen. For the first time since the passing of Louis XIII, you were genuinely alone when Mazarin passed away in March of 1661 AD. You received a fortune in diamonds from his will, including the Rose of England, a 14-carat diamond, an odd bequest to a widow queen from a purportedly celibate cardinal. You were gently but firmly removed from active government by Louis XIV, who is now 22 years old and prepared to reign alone. You did not resist. You had reared a monarch, kept France together throughout a civil war, and demonstrated that the terrified Spanish girl had always had the strength of a queen. What further needed to be demonstrated? After decades of being a baron, you were commissioned to rebuild Val de Grace, the convent that had been your haven during your darkest years. As a monument to the Virgin Mary, who had given you sons, you spent an increasing amount of your last years there. Instead of building a palace or a monument to yourself, you decided to construct a church, maybe because God was your only constant friend during those awful years, the only one who listened to your Spanish-language prayers when everyone else insisted on French. You saw your son repeat his father's faults while simultaneously becoming the most powerful monarch in Europe, the Sun King. He had other mistresses and treated Maria Theresa, his Spanish wife, with the same callous disregard that Louis XIII had shown you. Louis XIV had learnt too much from his father's example, despite your attempts to caution him in order to protect your niece. You are helpless to stop history from repeating itself in Baroque permutations. When political power became unattainable, one resorted to cultural influence. You quietly made sure that Spanish practices weren't completely eradicated from French court life, commissioned translations of Spanish literature, and supported Spanish artists in France. You could make France a little more Spanish, but you couldn't be Spanish anymore. The first signs of breast cancer arose in 1664 AD, memory by memory, drop by drop, a firm lump that continued to grow in spite of the doctor's interventions. You were aware of its meaning. In your 63 years, you had seen enough women perish from it. However, you handled death as you had learnt to handle. Everything with elegance that covered anguish and dignity that covered desperation. You prayed in Spanish while no one was looking during your last months at Val de Grace, where you were surrounded by nuns instead of courtiers. Louis XIV asked you whether you had any regrets as you lay dying. My only regret is that I must leave you, you said, as you gazed at this son you had waited 23 years to have. This king you had defended during the Civil War, and this guy who personified everything you had endured to attain. Of course, it was untrue. You wished you had witnessed more sunrises in Spain. The mom who passed away before she could impart her wisdom on surviving a hostile court. The 4 infants who were never able to breathe. The husband who might have loved you if you were French, he was Spanish, or you were completely different. Anne of Austria passed away on January 20th, 1666 AD. At the age of 64, she had outlived her husband by 23 years, which is precisely how many years you had been married without having children. A mathematical precision to pain and victory that seemed less like chance and more like cosmic justice. 23 years of humiliation followed by 23 years of power. You were laid to rest next to Louis XIII at Testideni. As you had never been in life, you were together in death. Simply put, Yadapitov says, mother of Louis XIV, wife of Louis XIII. Not a word about the surveillance, the seclusion, the dead infants, the treason charges, or the night spent crying in unfamiliar linens. There is no mention of the 14-year-old girl who was compelled to wed a boy who was unable to handle her, or the middle-aged widow who at last gained control of her life. Instead of being remembered as the young bride who pondered her wedding night, History will remember you as the mother of the Sun King. However, if you listen closely on winter nights, when storms captured travelers the way they formerly trapped kings, you may hear Spanish lullabies resonating through the stone of Valderas walls. Where no oranges grow, you may smell the aroma of orange blossoms. Before France turned her into an Austrian, you might perceive a shadow in the form of a girl who was Anna Maria Mauritia. She was turned into steel before suffering. That 14-year-old bride is still there, frozen in place when the wedding bells rang in Bordeaux. I'm still unsure if she did something incorrectly, stated something incorrectly, or was otherwise wrong. She is still looking for a husband who will never actually visit her in bed, for children who wouldn't come for decades, for a contentment that only lived in the pauses between heartbeats, in private moments, in Spanish prayers spoken in French churches. Think about the list of her losses: a mother at the age of 10, a homeland at the age of 14, 4 children before the age of 35, a husband who detested her, a language she had to forget, a name she had to give up, and a self she had to bury so deeply that the soul's archaeologists have yet to uncover it. Think of what she got: a place in history as the mother of France's greatest monarch, the reluctant respect of a court that had hated her, a regency her husband attempted to deny her, and 2 boys after 23 years of infertility. Was it worthwhile? Her portrait stands in the Versailles corridors, and the question lingers there: a French-style painting of a Spanish face, with an attitude halfway between victory and accusation. Dark eyes appear to follow spectators. She raised the Sun King, preserved the French monarchy, and kept the kingdom united during a civil war. But at what price? On the altar of dynastic need, how many parts of herself had she had to sacrifice? If Anne of Austria had remained Anna Maria Mauritia, we can never know what she may have been. If she had wed a Spanish prince who shared her memories of summertime atop castle walls, understood her prayers, and spoke her language. All we know is what she turned into: a survivor, a mother, a queen, a regent, and a ghost that haunts the space where political necessity and human sorrow meet. She is buried next to the man who made her life a torturous one at Testadeni, where you can still see her now. They shared a bed, a throne, and 2 boys who had influenced European history. Yet they died as strangers, 2 children who married before they understood what marriage meant. Remember the voice that began this tale as you stand in front of their memorials. The 14-year-old girl who would spend the rest of her life learning that queens are not created of love, but of survival. Not of joy, but of the gradual accumulation of power taken from those who would deny it. Had wedding bells ringing in Bordeaux in November of 1615 AD. Recall Anna Maria Mauritia, who went on to become Anne of Austria and the mother of the Sun King, exactly what they had hoped she would not become: one who will not let go of France in her clutches. Recall her as a winner who paid an excessive price for her triumph rather than as a victim. Some victories are indistinguishable from tragedies, and some crowns are made of thorns painted gold. Keep her in mind as a warning. The names of all the girls who were exchanged like treaties, sacrificed to forge alliances, married to strangers in foreign countries where their names sound weird and whose prayers go unheard, are still echoed by the bells that rung for her wedding. All of it was survived by Anne of Austria. However, living and surviving, are two different things. She passed away as a strong queen mother. However, a 14-year-old girl is still waiting for her real life to start, someplace in the Spanish sunshine that she never saw again. She continued to hold out hope that her husband would eventually come to love her. She is still holding onto the hope that this is all a nightmare and that she will awaken in her mother's embrace, in an orange blossom-scented bed, in a nation where love, not politics, is the reason for wedding bells, where girls who are 14 years old are permitted to stay youngsters for a short while. The sound of wedding bells wakes you up. However, they are quiet this time. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nestware. Every night, a new story takes flight.